Um, and I think a lot of your book, if I'd read the whole thing, would answer a lot of my questions, but
It's a dense book. Yeah.
but I'm really enjoying it. It's just the holidays, they kind of get in the way.
Right. I understand.
So I think I know the answer to this, but do you think we can connect historical events through telling stories about beer?
I mean, absolutely. It depends on what sort of events you want to connect, like grander ones or, more mundane, run-of-the-mill ones. I mean, I could find a parallel for almost any major event in the last 300 years in the Western world. So it depends on like how big you want to go in scope.
I think, we want to have fun with it. At the end of the day, this is entertainment.
Sure.
So I think it's kind of like whatever pops into your head that's fun or cool or
Okay.
relevant.
Well,
and of course, we do this with Brett, and on camera for the sizzle, we can cut around so we'll get the best sound bites. So what were you going to say?
Well, I mean, some of my favorites are the Mayflower. They landed early because the ship ran and the ship ran out of beer. they were they were trying to reach the English settlement in Jamestown, Virginia, right? And the crew, they had rented the ship and the crew needed beer for the trip back because they were going to drop off these religious fundamentalists who were fleeing England and turn around and go back to Europe. And the crew realized that they were running low on beer, and so they dropped these guys in Massachusetts, right? So that's one of my favorite stories because.
Beer run?
Huh?
So they basically went on a beer run?
Yeah, they realized, my God, we don't have enough beer to make it back to Europe, so we got to drop these guys early. And that had, you can sort of extrapolate from that. It's sort of a profound influence on history. I mean, all the city of Boston and the Boston area and all the universities sprung up because these guys landed here and not in Jamestown. And I mean, I would be in much warmer weather right now if it were not for the Mayflower running out of beer. Because my wife works at Harvard, so that's why we're here.
Oh wow, okay.
I also, this is another local one. This is not as grand, but Paul Revere was a heavy beer drinker. And one of the reasons that he went on that ride, which was sort of a suicidal ride if you think about it, because the British were all over the Boston area and they were armed to the teeth and they were looking for rebels to kill, he was drunk enough, and he was known to be drunk and bold, and bold when he drank. And so he hopped on his horse and warned of the British attack. Then the other big one that I liked is that the Kingdom of Belgium, the modern state of Belgium, probably owes its existence to beer because Great Britain was tired of paying hops prices to the Netherlands, high hops prices, so they sort of engineered the independence of Belgium in the 1830s. So, anyway, so you can go on and on like this, and once you have the event itself, you can extrapolate, aftershocks and effects of it. So.
For instance, I love those stories. What's an aftershock and effect of?
Well, the Mayflower landing early, right? So the major settlement, the Puritan settlement happens in New England. You get the region of New England and all that happened here, right? And their descendants 140, 150, 200 years later foment the American Revolution. So there's that. Like if they had landed in Jamestown, it's not entirely clear that would have happened, right? Belgium, created as a buffer between France and Germany. That was the pretext, right? But Germany invades through Belgium at least twice in world history. The first time, World War I, the German invasion of Belgium touches off English participation in that war, and it becomes a global war. Paul Revere, obviously, if the militiamen in Lexington and Concord hadn't been warned, the British would have trounced them, and that's the end of that revolution. So.
I love that. That's exactly what we're looking for. So what is that you're drinking?
Oh, this is just water. Sorry. Yeah.
What should Life, Love, and Beer, in your opinion, say about beer that hasn't been said on other TV shows about beer?
Right. My advice on that is most of the shows about beer, and I've been consulted on at least one and then one documentary. they tend to end up as kind of broy and like insider baseball. So it's men who look like me with like the permanent 5 o'clock shadow and cords and whatnot, talking about beer to themselves, right? So it tends to be a little provincial. Um,
Mhm.
there's little effort has been made, at least from what I can see, to sort of expand the scope and reach of it through things like history, through things like social trends, through things like its relationship with wine or the slow food movement or fine dining, things like that. It tends to sort of parachute in and present it as this phenomena within, sort of men in their 20s and 30s drinking beer. It seems to be limited in scope. So if you guys made something wider, that would be more interesting and more if it appealed to more people, who don't look
Mhm.
like me, that would be a real coup.
They call that co-viewing, where your
Oh yeah,
wife or somebody walks through the room and then they're like, "Well, wait a minute, that
yeah.
might
I
be
mean,
interesting to me."
yeah. Beer in general, I mean, is treated as um, it's treated craft beer especially is treated as a limited thing for some reason. Or if it's covered at all, and I'm not just talking about television, I'm talking about media in general. Um, it's the parachute variety. People come in, they understand it as this limited thing. They don't assume it's wider, and then if you start from that assumption that it's limited, you write from that assumption, right? And I get calls, at least one call every say 2 or 3 weeks now, from reporters at national and local papers and magazines, and they act like it's the newest thing, like it's the newest trend, right? And that it's still, it drives me mad. It drives me nuts because it's hard to get across that it's not, number one, and that it is wider and it has much wider interest.
That's great. Um, okay, that it is wider. Okay, so our writer, who's part of our team, is an author. He writes about food. Has not written about beer to date.
Mm-hmm.
But the sizzle that I mean, that's not the sizzle. The written pitch that you may not have had a chance to read yet, but mentions your name, um, is about pale ale. So the first brewery, for example, might
Was it about pale ale or India pale ale? 'Cause
I'm
I read.
sorry, India Pale Ale.
Okay.
So is there anything you'd like to share about India Pale Ale?
I mean, I've actually written about. I wrote an op-ed for the Wall Street Journal a few months ago about IPAs actually, because hop prices. It actually started as an op-ed for the New York Times, but then the Times top editors, there's some sort of, well, you're probably familiar, there was a big upheaval there, and it just fell through. Anyway, so I took it to the Journal, and the Times had pitched me because hops prices were going through were and are going through the roof because there's a hop shortage worldwide right now for various reasons, um, and that's affecting IPAs. Okay, the production of IPAs, because IPAs are traditionally more bitter, and what makes beer bitter is more hops, right? So the hop it's a real problem for craft beer because so many new breweries, and there's several thousand now in the licensing process or have just opened, is because so many of them hang their flagship brands and offerings on bitter IPAs. Okay, so
Mm-hmm.
that's one aspect. I mean, it's very much within the industry and and among serious beer drinkers and retailers. IPAs are a very talked about subject right now because of the hop shortage. The other thing is the history of the IPA. Uh, there's various theories as to how it was developed. One says that you know, when India was a colony of Great Britain and they needed to get beer to the soldiers stationed there, and at the time it had to go all the way around the Horn of Africa up to India. They used hops as a preservative because hops do act as a preservative, and therefore that's how you got the bitterer beer, and they just sort of said, oh, okay, we'll name it India Pale Ale because it's a bitterer form of our existing Pale Ale. There's another theory that says a London brewer named George Hodgson came up with it on his own and just sort of marketed it because India was exotic to the average English person then. Um, and the third theory that I just found out about actually is that there was, the English loved their claret, what we call Bordeaux wine in this country, from France, right? But in
Right.
the mid 19th century, there is a infestation that destroys this bug called Phylloxera basically eats through the vines in Bordeaux in France, southwestern France, right? So it affects the claret trade. It affects claret supplies go dangerously low in England and all around the empire. So they have to find They have to find other things to get drunk on. One of them actually, this set off the golden age of whiskey, for instance, and Scotch whiskey, right? But it also set off a race for more beer styles. At least I think this is my theory, because in that time period you have not only the IPAs developed, but the porter and the modern stout are developed. And these are wildly popular beers into the 20th century, and they're all enjoying a revival right now, especially in the United States. So, but that's IPA right there.
And the IPA came out of that?
I think so. I don't think it was Hodgson. I think the India story is too convenient, but probably rings true because the beer was used as a preservative. But so many other things could go wrong with it. Like these guys were not. I mean, they didn't understand, for instance, the role of yeast then at that point. They didn't understand they understood sanitation, but they didn't understand the importance of it and the bacteria growth that could happen. So these beers are taking 7 to 8 weeks, sometimes 12 weeks, rolling around in ventilated oak barrels or other wooden barrels. I just can't believe that they would have arrived in India in good quality, regardless of how much hops were put in. So I actually think that it had to do with the bug, the infestation, eating through the grapes and the grapevines in France. And that set off sort of a race to find other intoxicants.
That's just...
If you know any Brits, they can find any way to drink at any time of the day. So they were not going to sit on their hands.
That's wonderful. So Brett wanted to ask the question, what makes India Pale Ales taste different from lagers?
Well, an India Pale Ale is an ale, so it's a bottom fermenting yeast. So different types of yeast and fermentation process. Ales generally can ferment at any temperature, right, up to 90 degrees. I mean, ales are really popular with home brewers because you don't need to keep them at a constant low temperature like you do with lager. The term lager actually comes from a German word that has to do with caves, because that's where they used to literally lager beer. They use it as a verb.
Wow.
Yeah, so there's that. Ales are thicker because of the fermentation process and the yeast. Thicker in taste, not necessarily in viscosity, but just they're heartier. Lagers are thinner.
Mm-hmm.
And IPAs are more bitter, a lot more bitter than your average lager.
Yes.
Although there's a movement now for a small trend called IPLs, India Pale Lagers, in the United States. I don't see them taking, but there's some breweries doing it. So you have like a thinner beer that's hoppy, that's very hoppy.
That sounds appealing to me.
Yeah.
First I've heard of that.
Okay.
Who has those?
The only one that Sam Adams has one, I think, an IPL. You probably can't get this out there, but what the hell are they called? They're out in Framingham, Massachusetts. Three brothers started a brewery. It's called Jack's Abbey, and they only make lagers. That was sort of the regnant form is ale right now. Everybody loves ale, and that's what most craft brewers in the United States make. But these guys only make lagers, and so that's their kind of claim to fame. And so one of their lagers is an India Pale Lager.
Cool.
Okay. So why do you think there's fads? For instance, Brett was saying, why was Budweiser the leading beer and now they're losing ground?
Well, I mean, the quickest answer to that is just, there was prohibition, right? So it wipes out the brewing industry. Repealed in 1933. Only the big guys like Anheuser-Busch and Miller could scale upward very quickly and take advantage of an empty marketplace. So that's really the reason. It's not necessarily that Americans came to prefer that style as sort of thin, bastardized Pilsner. It's just that it was there. It was available, and these guys bought up all the competition or forced the competition out through squeezing distribution or, that was the biggest way, or, taking up all the supply onto themselves for making beer. But, it's interesting because by the 1960s, there were only a handful of breweries making most of the beer in the United States. Then you have this expansion in options, and we're seeing Anheuser-Busch and Miller and Coors losing market share consistently, at least in the United States and North America. And that's why there's, 50 Anheuser-Busch breweries in China right now. It's because these guys are sort of ceding the United States to the craft brewers. I mean, they realize it will take a generation or two, but they're sort of giving up on it. The best they can hope for is to stay steady and keep half the market share, say, in 20 years. Right now, they have about 85%. And they're concentrating on Brazil, Russia, India, and China.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to skip over a few of these questions in essence of time because it's New Year's Eve and everybody's got places to go. So, sort of being a woman, I'm interested in any stories you have about beer and love.
Beer and love.
I
There's
know
several.
it's weird.
Huh?
I know it's weird, but it's in our title, so I had to
Well,
ask.
I know of at least 2 barley wines, and barley wines are traditionally very strong beers, high alcohol content. Barley wines were actually started in the 19th century, so that's another example of English ingenuity trying to offset the claret shortage. These barley wines call themselves baby makers because they're so high. Is that what you're going for, or sort of love affairs through history, royal marriages, that type of thing, or?
I mean, I think we're just trying to get some ideas and have fun with it.
Well, there's that obvious aspect, but the love story that jumps to mind is the birth of Oktoberfest, and that concept was the Crown Prince of Bavaria in 1810 got married, and it's said that the brewers of Bavaria made a special type of beer in celebration, and everybody got drunk for several days because that's what you did at royal weddings.
Fun.
That's what you do. I mean, people got hammered when Kate married what's his name, but so Oktoberfest, both the festival that still goes on in Bavaria and imitators all over the world, and the beer styles all date from that marriage in 1810. So that's an example. I would have to think about that more. I wouldn't doubt that beer has played a role in cementing some of these unions. I know Charles V, who was one of the most powerful men to ever live, his empire included, most of modern day Western Europe, including Belgium, what's now Belgium, as well as the Spanish territories in the New World. He was a big beer drinker, loved beer, and there's still a Charles Quint beer brand out of Spain. So.
Cool.
That is cool.
So, any comments about beer and life in general? Just in how it. I mean, story. I guess the story about the Mayflower, that's phenomenal. Never even had any clue. Any other stories like that?
I mean, yeah. I mean, the Obama is the first president to brew beer at the White House.
Cool.
They actually made a honey ale or honey porter, honey ale. I think it's honey ale in 2000 for the Super Bowl in 2011, and they used honey from the White House grounds, from a beehive in the White House grounds. And actually, the chef who did it, Rob Cass, just stepped down as White House mess chief. But so there's that. The last president to brew beer was George Washington, though he didn't live in the White House, and you can still find his handwritten pumpkin ale recipe.
Really?
At the public library. Yep. It sounds awful though, because it just calls for a ton. They didn't know about yeast. Again, they didn't know about the role of sanitation, all that. But it just called for a ton of pumpkin rinds, and some molasses and water, and let it sit there and see what happens. That brings me to another story. Brewing was huge in monasteries in Western Europe, and still is, although not many monks actually brew. They contract out their names and they hire staff. But the monks used before Louis Pasteur and the role of yeast was clear in the late 1800s. The monks would pray over the beer vats at night, go to bed, and wake up the next morning. And of course, it only takes a few hours for fermentation to get started, and they'd see the little, the crowns and the head on on the vat and think it was a miracle that God had again blessed their batch.
Now that's a keeper. Love
No, there's
that.
all sorts of examples. Like Orval is a brewery in Belgium near the French border. I've actually been there. It's lovely. It's one of the 6 Trappist breweries in Belgium. And Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette were fleeing there in 1791. That they were trying to get over the French, what was then the French Dutch, the Belgian Netherlands, whatever it was called, the Dutch French frontier, when they were caught and brought back to Paris, with obviously dire consequences for them. But they were trying to reach the Orval monastery right over the border, which had and still has a brewery. But there's numerous examples. In the United States of breweries as being sort of transformative, not only of the surrounding geographical areas or their consumer base, but also of the lives of the people involved. I mean, it's just the backstories of some of these guys are pretty incredible. Anyway.
Wonderful. Two questions when we'll finish. Is there anything else in particular you want to tell us about that we haven't asked that you want to cover?
But see, I read the summary, and it's sort of, you say you want to start out with a challenge or a problem with each episode.
That's the concept as it is right now.
I mean, my feeling is like I said in the beginning, these approaches tend to be sort of circumscribed and designed to appeal to like 35-year-old men who like to drink. I think this is very interesting in its wider scope, or wider attempt at a wider scope, say. So I like that. I think you could introduce any sort of historical question at the beginning and connect it to beer somehow. I think that could really work. You would just have to pick. You'd have to pick wisely. You don't want to pick. You want to pick a narrow question to have wider effects.
Right, and it's true. We are appealing to the demographic that's like I don't know, 18 or 25 to 54, but all networks like the co-viewing, so I think that's why a lot of these stories, to me personally, and so hopefully that'll translate to other women and other people, that they're not just sort of one note.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, this is sort of an aside, but women, this is another thing that drives me nuts and drives women nuts who are in the industry. They've been connected to craft beer since almost the beginning. There have been some serious female pioneers, and they were just overlooked, or they were literally patronized as like hangers-on, or only there because of their husbands or boyfriends or whatever. But there were some serious female pioneers from the very beginning. I can tell you I'm blanking on her name, but we talked a few weeks ago. Wendy Littlefield. She's a co-founder of Omegang. Do you know Omegang? You familiar with that, or?
No.
It's
Wendy
a
Littlefield?
national distribution, so look for it. A fantastic brewery out of Cooperstown, New York. She was saying to me, I got tired of people saying to me, her and her husband started together in the early 90s. And she said, I got tired of people saying to me, oh, you must love working with your husband.
Aww.
Yeah. Anyway, but that's the example. Like women have been into this for a long time. They're only getting recognized now.
Yeah, well, that's wonderful. Thank you for that lead. We've got one woman we're trying to track down that looks very interesting, and I would like to be in touch with Wendy. That she sounds great, so I'll try to contact her between Jamie and myself. Well, thank you so much. Happy New Year. I'm just curious, what are you going to be drinking to ring in the New Year?
I don't know. We have a 15-month-old who doesn't always go to bed at the right time, so I don't know if I will be drinking.
Oh.
Anyway, but thank you for asking. What is the next step again? You said something about January 27th?
Yeah, next week, next Thursday, what we're going to do with this tape is it creates a file that Jamie and I will share with the director, Brett. I'm sure we'd like to interview you next Thursday if that works for your schedule. If it doesn't, we'll try to work around you.
Okay.
And what we'll try to do is come up with a technical way. It's weird, I'm looking at you and I know you can't see me. A technical way, even if you had to hold up your smartphone
Okay.
while we're having a conversation like this, so you could, you can do that thing where it's almost a selfie,
Okay.
or we'll get a still picture or a series of still pictures, because we at this point we probably don't have enough budget to get a local cameraman, but
Mhm.
for the show we would fly you in, or we would fly to you to do your portion of it. But so the next step is we're going to cut a professional looking sizzle like the one I sent you a
Okay.
link. Okay, as much as we can with the resources we have. We do have a tiny budget, but it is tiny. And then I will take that with. We'll keep rewriting the written pitch that you saw, and Brett will lay it out and make it look, hipper with more graphics. And there's this conference January 27th in DC where all of the buyers for all of the cable networks are, and I've been there like 8 years, so I know a lot of them, and I start selling at that point. So I'll be trying to set up one-on-one meetings where I'll show the sizzle. There's a chance that we've made an overture to a celebrity host. If that doesn't work, then we'll figure out who will be the host, and rewrite it that way. And that's when we'll start selling. And then the kind of selling period lasts for a whole year, and it generally plays out by June. So there's two big events. There's one in January and one in June, when the buyers are buying programming. And obviously beer shows are really popular. When I went last year and at the follow-up meetings in LA and New York and DC that I had separately from the conference, they're all saying that all the networks are saying typical network wants middle-aged guy, the History Channel guy, Discovery, Destination America, middle-aged guy, 35 to 54, but they want this co-viewing. They want a wider audience. So your input with the storylines, I think, are great, because it's our job to try to make it be distinctive. And that sounds like the way that James, our writer, was going, and it sounds like that's sort of your input too. So that's the next steps.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So are you available next Thursday?
Next Thursday,
The 8th.
yeah, I should be all day actually. So.
Okay. All right. So we'll get with Brett, and Jamie and I'll be in touch with you, either one of us. And thanks so much, and have a happy New Year with your new baby and family. Okay.
You guys too. Okay. Take care.
Take care, Tom. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.